Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Brooke Boyer, and I'm from the Division for Strategic Planning and Performance at UNITAR. UNITAR is pleased to partner with UNICEF and Eval SDG Network in this particular webinar. First of all, thank you for everyone for your patience. Some of us have been online now for a bit. We weren't aware of the time change in the United States. But at any rate, welcome to everyone. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Michael Quinn Patton. Michael is the founder of and CEO of the Utilization-Focused Evaluation, an independent organizational developmental and program evaluation organization. He's also former president, as many of you know, of the American Evaluation Association and author of 8 major evaluation books, including 4th editions of the Utilization-Focused Evaluation and Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods used in 500 universities worldwide. He has also authored a number of other publications, including Practical Evaluation, Creative Evaluation, Developmental Evaluation, Applying Systems and Thinking, Systems Thinking and Complexity Concepts to Enhance Innovation and Use. He has co-authored a book on the dynamics of social innovation and transformation with 2 Canadians entitled Getting to Maybe, How the World is Changed. He is also a recipient of the Martel Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Useful and Practical Evaluation Practice, the Lazarsfeld Award for Lifelong Contributions to Evaluation Theory, and the 2017 Research Evaluation Award, all from the American Evaluation Association. He regularly conducts training for the Evaluators Institute in the United States and the International Program for Development Evaluation Training. His latest books are Principles Focused Evaluation and Facilitating Evaluation Principles in Practice, both published in 2018. Before handing the floor, or the airwaves, I should say, or the internet waves to Michael for his presentation, which we're all looking forward to, allow me just to briefly introduce another colleague, Florence Etta, who, as many of you know, is the National Secretary General of the Nigerian Association of Evaluators, and Florence will be closing the webinar after we've had the presentation and hopefully a fruitful exchange and question and answer period. So without further ado, Michael, let me hand you the floor, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation, and thank you for your engagement.
Thank you, Brooke. And hello, Florence. It's been a while since I've seen you, and everyone else. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you about the evaluation use and influence. I've been at it for 50 years now, and that has been the centerpiece of my evaluation career. The Utilization-Focused Evaluation book is the mainstay of where I've reported the research we've done on use. The first edition of that book came out in 1978. And as Brooke said, there have been 4 editions of it, each of which has become substantially longer because the field has grown so much, especially internationally and globally, and with new issues and challenges there. But use is at the core of much of what determines the credibility and meaningfulness of our field. And so that makes it a especially opportune time for us to talk about how use and influence are affecting things these days. So it is a research-based approach. We've been studying use for some 50 years, and what I'll be sharing with you is basically what we've learned from studying use, from following up evaluations and interviewing users and finding out what works and doesn't work for them. There have been both studies in the United States and in Europe and worldwide. This is the cover of a World Bank report on influential evaluations focused on development evaluation. It found that a conducive policy environment is important to use, that the timing of the evaluation matters, that the role of the evaluation is important, and that building a relationship with the client and effective communication of the evaluation findings are important. these are examples of the kind of lessons that come out of our work. And what I'm going to talk with you about is how to actually apply these lessons in practice. So utilization-focused evaluation is a decision-making framework for enhancing the utility and actual use of evaluations. Any other kind of evaluation can be done under a utilization-focused evaluation framework. So it's a way of deciding which evaluation approach, what methods, what questions will be most useful to answer within a particular context. Utilization-focused evaluation begins with the premise that evaluations should be judged by their utility and actual use. Therefore, evaluators should facilitate the evaluation process and design any evaluation with careful consideration of how everything that will be done from beginning to end will affect use. That's basically what it means to be utilization-focused. This means taking use seriously by evaluating use, the source of our own accountability and ongoing learning and professional development. Every evaluation I conduct and ever have conducted, and I ran an evaluation center at the University of Minnesota for a number of years. I'm coming to you today from the state of Minnesota in the north central part of the United States. We follow up our evaluations to find out how they've been used, how recommendations have been received, what made sense, what didn't make sense, how they've been acted upon. And that's how we get better at this. We ask programs to follow up and find out what has happened to participants. That's standard evaluation practice. And yet I find that relatively few evaluations actually apply that same logic to evaluation. We ought to follow up our evaluations to find out what has happened to them. And so the process of learning that goes on by actually including in our responsibilities, not just conducting evaluations, not just reporting on them, but following up to learn how they've been used, what worked and didn't work, and get better at what we're doing is part of being utilization focused. Use is different from dissemination. I'll ask people how their evaluation has been used, and they'll say, well, it's been downloaded 1,000 times from the website. That's not use. Use is people using it to inform decision-making, to help them improve programs at the staff level, for beneficiaries to be able to express their concerns, what's working and not working for them, and have those concerns acted upon. So sending around findings is not use. That's dissemination. It's also different from producing reports. One of the major obstacles to use is that evaluation terms of reference treat the report as the deliverable, and contracts are written, scopes of work are written, terms of reference are written to have the evaluation conclude with a report. From a utilization-focused point of view, a report is an output. It's not an outcome. In logic modeling terms, the report is an output. The outcome is use. And so reports are a means to an end, not the end themselves. Indeed, part of what we've learned is that we need to follow up reports and recommendations with intended users to help them implement and attend to the findings in the report. That means that I urge that contracts and terms of reference and evaluation include time beyond the report, significant time beyond the report, to follow up with implementation and application. So in all of the evaluations that I do, my contracts include 3 to 6 months of follow-up to help track what has happened to the findings and the report, to make presentations, to help keep the findings before the group. And that should be built into evaluation budgets. Likewise, the groundwork is laid and expectations set at the beginning. That means that there is work to do to get ready for evaluation. This is like tilling the soil in agriculture. You don't just go out and spread the seeds on the hard ground. You have to till the soil, get it ready for receiving those seeds. In utilization-focused evaluation, that means working up front with the intended users to be sure that the questions being asked are relevant, that people have the capacity to engage in the evaluation process and are prepared to use the findings when they come in. So while much of our work focuses on the actual conduct of the evaluation and the report, what utilization-focused evaluation draws our attention to is the work to get ready for evaluation, to till the soil, to prepare people, and the follow-up work to help with the application and implementation of findings. And finally, none of this happens naturally or automatically. What research shows, in fact, what research on how people make decisions, how our brains work, shows is that it's not natural for people to use evaluation findings. We all have our own biases. We all would prefer to think that we're doing a good job. And so to actually use evaluation findings, to take them seriously, is not something that happens naturally or automatically. It requires facilitation, it requires engagement. The most recent book I did last year on facilitating evaluation is about this process of both engaging people at the beginning and following up to be sure that evaluation gets used. And it means dealing with the political environment, the organizational environment, to figure out how and when you can do evaluation to make it useful. This is a photograph of the major interstate highway that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul across the Mississippi River in Minnesota. It's the major highway that runs across the entire northern part of the United States. And on August 1st, 2007, the bridge collapsed. A major investigation was undertaken and found that the bridge had been inspected and that there were pictures taken of the plates that hold the vertical and horizontal sections together. And a report was written saying the bridge was in danger of collapsing and nothing was done. This picture is a picture of what can happen when evaluation is ignored, when evaluation data are not used. In 2005, in a joint meeting of the Canadian Evaluation Society and the American Evaluation Association, and an international joint meeting, we gave the world's first Speaking Truth to Power award at that meeting. And that award was given to General Romeo Dallaire, the United Nations head of the peacekeeping forces in Rwanda, for his efforts in attempting to prevent the genocide in Rwanda. He wrote detailed reports about the deteriorating situation in Rwanda and asked for authority to intervene to stop the genocide. He asked for additional troops and resources and authorization. That was refused, and the genocide resulted. General Dallaire did not know of the evaluation associations, but from our perspective, he was writing evaluation reports which were ignored. And so these dramatic stories of ignoring evaluation give us pause and elevate the importance of our work. Much of the world is ignoring the reporting that's going on now on climate change and the imminent dangers that come with climate change, and ignoring the reports that come out of UNICEF about the challenges for children around the world. And so getting public policymakers getting decision makers to pay attention to the data is a core part of our professional work. This cartoon from the book shows a program director being asked how she uses evaluation, and she says, "I can honestly say that not a day goes by when we don't use these evaluations in one way or another." Well, we're hoping that our evaluations do more than hold up a desk or keep a window open. But the use is not automatic. The challenge is to move evaluation from a compliance activity, from just doing the paperwork to just writing reports, to something that actually gets the attention of decision makers and program staff and policy makers to inform their decisions and actions and budgeting. So let me turn to our overall professional commitment to evaluation use. In 1979, major scholarly organizations formed a joint committee to establish standards for evaluation. Those standards have been revised 3 times, and there are 40 joint committee standards. Many of the national associations have adopted the evaluation standards, translated them, sometimes revised them slightly. I'm not going to go through all 40. They're available on the web, but they're in 5 categories. The first one of which is utility. And basically what the standards say is that no matter how methodologically sophisticated an evaluation is, no matter how good the report is, if the evaluation is not used, it's a bad evaluation. Use is an outcome criteria. It's a criteria for judging whether or not we're doing good work. And so we have an obligation to evaluate our work to determine if it's being used, as I said earlier. The second set of standards have to do with feasibility, that the evaluations are realistic, prudent, diplomatic, and frugal. The highest standard in some ways is that the evaluations should provide sufficient value that it justifies their cost. This is a recognition that every dollar spent on evaluation is a dollar not spent on direct services. Certainly program staff are well aware of this. And so the frugal standard, the feasibility standard, calls on us to be sure that we are providing sufficient value to justify money taken away from direct service for evaluation, that we ought to be improving decision-making and improving programs at a level that justifies that kind of budgeting. The third set of standards are propriety standards that have to do with acting legally, ethically, and respectfully. The fourth set of standards have to do with accuracy, that the results are worth using. And finally, the accountability standards call on us to evaluate our evaluation work, what we call meta-evaluation, especially for high-stakes evaluations. So the Joint Committee of Standards are our professional commitments. Every evaluation that I do, I give my client and the organization I work with, the people I'm going to be working with, the intended users of the evaluation, I give them a copy of these standards. And I tell them, this is what I'm professionally responsible for. I tell them I'm part of an international network of some 50,000 evaluators worldwide, and we have adopted these standards for what constitutes a good evaluation. It's useful, it's feasible or practical, it's ethical, it's accurate, and it's accountable. Now, specifically for development evaluation, we have the quality standards for development evaluation from DAC, and the major section of the DAC evaluation standards also addresses follow-up, use, and learning. In fact, the DAC standards go farther than the Joint Committee standards. So that in section 4.1, it says that the evaluation is designed, conducted, and reported to meet the needs of the intended users. Conclusions, recommendations, and lessons are clear, relevant, targeted, and actionable, so that evaluation can be used to achieve its intended learning and accountability objectives. The evaluation is delivered in time to ensure optimal use of the results. Goes on to talk about getting the findings out to intended audiences. 4.2 calls for a systematic response to and follow-up on recommendations by those who receive the report, and that reports should be disseminated and transparently so that people know what the findings are. So the DAC standards, like the Joint Committee standards, make use a primary criterion for evaluating evaluations, a primary criterion for determining what is a good evaluation. So the overall goal of utilization-focused evaluation is the intended use by intended users. What that means then is that we, at the beginning of an evaluation, as it is negotiated, have to be able to specify two things. Who is the evaluation for, and what do they intend to do with it? And to design the evaluation around that focus, intended use by intended users. This is the goal of an evaluation. Who's it for, and what are they going to do with it? So when we follow up an evaluation, we find out if the intended users use the evaluation in intended ways. Early in evaluation, there was talk of providing reports to audiences, and then we began to use the language of stakeholders. In utilization-focused evaluation, we use the language of primary intended users. Audiences are passive. Stakeholders are more engaged. Primary intended users focus on people who are actually going to use the information. And so that shows the evolution of our thinking in this regard. The personal factor we found in research is a primary factor in determining use, and that means that the intended users are interested in the evaluation, they care about the evaluation, they're engaged in thinking about the findings, thinking about relevant questions. We call that the personal factor because where people care about evaluation, it's more likely to get used. They don't care about evaluation, it doesn't get used. That becomes an interpersonal factor because of the interactions between evaluators and intended users. So we say that there are 5 critical success factors in use. And these 5 critical success factors are people, 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 people. Organizations don't use evaluation. Institutions don't use evaluation. People use evaluation. So the idea of primary intended users is knowing who the evaluation is for and what they're going to do with it. And then aiming the evaluation towards that use. Identifying and involving primary intended users in determining intended uses. Now, a part of that engagement is to find out when evaluation findings will be most relevant. Again, the people who write evaluation contracts, terms of reference, scopes of work are doing so generically with boilerplate language. But when we're actually conducting an evaluation, despite whatever the terms of reference may say about when an evaluation is due, midterm, end of program, whatever it may say, the job of an evaluator is to find out from intended users when they will actually be making decisions. So that a major reason evaluations don't get used is that evaluations are not in sync with the budget process in an organization and with the strategy process in organizations, or the program improvement processes of organizations. For example, if there's a strategic planning process or a strategic engagement process in an organization, the evaluations should be timed to inform that process. Evaluation findings should be timed to inform budgetary decisions. Formative evaluations, evaluations aimed at feedback and improvement, should be timed to be available for staff retreats, or sessions when staff are looking back at how they're doing and looking forward at what they're going to do better. Connect evaluation to ongoing organizational processes. Unfortunately, many evaluations, perhaps most, have a life of their own. The conducted evaluation, the reporting has a life of its own and doesn't connect to these fundamental organizational and policy-making processes. So to know how an evaluation is being used, we distinguish different kinds of use as the stakeholders we engage with get down to the primary intended users. This cartoon looks a little violent, I realize, but it's meant to show the process of moving from stakeholders in general to the people who are actually going to use the evaluation in person. Finally, we have to be able to articulate use options. And so there are evaluations that are summative, that are at the end of a program or project to determine its overall merit and worth. There are improvement-oriented evaluations, formative evaluations. There are developmental evaluations for ongoing development. There are knowledge-building evaluations to generate lessons learned. There are accountability evaluations. There's M&E processes with a focus on monitoring. These constitute different kinds of evaluation for different purposes. And our job is to ensure that we know what particular purpose a evaluation is going to serve. No one evaluation can do all these things well. No single evaluation can meet the needs of everybody. So let me give an example of these differences for something like the UNICEF's policy on the child's best interest principle in adoption, specifically in internal country adoption. The best interest of the child represents a great challenge in terms of determination and implementation and adoption practice. So if a evaluation is formative, it's aimed at improving that process. If an evaluation is summative, it's aimed at rendering an overall judgment about how well a program has been done. If an evaluation is developmental, it would work with people as they were implementing a new approach for dealing with adoption in a country and working alongside the people innovating, doing exploration and innovation in new ways. Monitoring data would keep track of the numbers and types of adoption. Accountability would make sure that the laws were complied with in country and the rights of children internationally. These different kinds of evaluation serve different audiences and get used in different ways. So being strategic about who the evaluation is for and how it's going to be used is at the core of utilization-focused evaluation. Brooke, let me stop there and take any questions or comments at this point, and then later I can add a bit about utilization-focused evaluation methods.
Thank you, Michael. Do we have any questions from anyone on the webinar? You can raise your hand, or you can simply type your questions in the chat box. One question in the Q&A. Q&A, let me read that out. What is your view on the increasing use of shoestring evaluations, increasing demands with decreasing resources available to undertake the evaluations, with some always willing to do it? Race to the bottom. This was from, I believe, Angel. I don't know, Angela. I can't remember. I can't read the name there. That's one question. The second question, Mike, was how do you encourage extended time in the terms of references to evaluate the use of the evaluations you prepare? Most clients would see this as more money. And a third question that we've got in the Q&A box is, what is your view on the increasing use of the shoestring evaluations? Oh, this is the same as we had before that was just retyped. So why don't you address these two questions, Michael, if you can?
Sure. And they're related because both of them have to do with getting resources for evaluation. And this is the reason that I went over the standards. The standards give us guidance. Remember that the DAC standards have been adopted by OECD and by the international agencies. The Joint Committee standards have been adopted by the professional associations of evaluations as identifying what constitutes quality evaluation. And so I think it becomes important to be able to say to funders in both of these questions, we can't do a good job. We can't do the kind of job that we as professionals are obligated to do and our standards if we don't have sufficient resources. That includes time to be sure that the evaluation is prepared well, and follow-up time to make sure that it's well done and is applied. And so there are really two messages here that I'm urging you to internalize and use in developing scopes of work or reacting to terms of reference and scopes of work. Is that both the first is that the standards and these recommendations for what resources are needed for the front end work, the back end follow-up work is based upon both research about what makes evaluation useful, and our values as expressed in the Joint Committee standards and the DAC criteria. And so as an independent consultant, now I have more freedom than most people do. I won't do an evaluation unless I can do it right. I turn down a lot of work where the resources aren't adequate. I think we have an obligation to say, we can't do a good job on a shoestring. We can't do a good job unless there's time at the beginning and time at the end to follow through. That's not just your personal opinion expressing that. You need to be able to say that based upon 50 years of evaluation research on use and the commitment of the profession to be useful, here are the practices that evaluators recommend. And that means we need to advocate for high quality evaluation, for evaluations that will be used and that are worth using. And be forceful about that. That's what I devote my time doing. That's why I write the books and speak to policymakers, is to say, this is what we know it takes to do a good job, and advocate for that.
Thank you, Michael. Just announcement to participants, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. It's perhaps a bit easier than using the chat box. Two other questions that I would like to read out, Michael, is one is you mentioned that it's the role of the evaluator to follow up after the evaluation is terminated. How can an independent evaluator with limited power inside an organization make sure the findings and recommendations are followed up upon? And then what are the things to bear in mind in evaluating an annual forum, summit, or conference? This came from another colleague. And then one other one just popped up too, in terms of what is the difference in terms of content to be evaluated between midterm evaluations and final evaluations. This might be a little bit beyond the topic of the webinar. Michael, any suggestions on that in terms of how an organization with limited power inside an organization can make sure that these things are, these recommendations are followed up upon and applied, implemented?
Well, thank you. Thank you for those questions. They're important questions, and I appreciate them. So the follow-up commitment really requires a leadership commitment and an evaluation culture, a learning culture that embeds the importance of evaluation in the organization. Much of what I just came from the American Evaluation Association meeting all last week. And there's a great deal of attention now being paid to not just conducting evaluations, but creating an evaluation culture, creating a learning culture, building in evaluative thinking, engaging leaders in appreciating evaluation and being committed to use evaluation. So an independent evaluator in an organization should be looking at the organization's policies for evaluation, should be looking at how scopes of work are written, and to again articulate that the end of an evaluation and its recommendations and conclusions should get a response from the people to whom it's provided, whether that's management, funders, staff, and that it is a part of the obligation, even for an independent evaluator, to follow up and find out if people understand the report, if they're setting aside time to address the report and to make that part of the work. That's creating a culture of inquiry in the organization, not allowing evaluation to just be a compliance activity, not just get it done. And the independent evaluators have to express that vision and lobby for it with the leadership and make it clear why that's important. So that you're creating what amounts to a learning organization. Most leaders want to be a learning organization. That means that they have to provide evaluators with time at the beginning and time after evaluation findings to help embed the evaluation findings into the evaluation culture. The question of midterm and end of project evaluation actually is very relevant to use. This may be the area of greatest confusion in the world around evaluation, because the midterm and end of project evaluation is in fact the most common form of evaluation in the world. It is standard boilerplate for international agencies of all kinds, for philanthropic foundations of all kinds, for NGOs of all kinds. The midterm evaluation is aimed at determining progress, and the end of project evaluation is aimed at determining overall effectiveness. The purpose of a midterm evaluation is improvement. The purpose of an end of program evaluation is to inform decision-making about the future of the program. The problem with that design is, from a practical point of view, decisions about whether a program is going to continue can never be taken at the end of the program. Given bureaucratic budgeting, given staff commitments, given agreements with countries and NGOs, in fact, it usually in a 3-year program, the decision about whether the program is going to continue is going to be made at least a year to a year and a half before the end of the program in order to do contracts and meet commitments, which means that practically the midterm evaluation is actually the summative evaluation. And if the program is going to continue, then the end of program evaluation is a formative evaluation for the next phase. We actually have these things turned around. The pretense that you can actually do an end of program evaluation to inform decision-making about the future of the program is nonsense, because it's too late. All the decisions will be made by the time the evaluation is done. One of the major reasons evaluations don't get done is because of this nonsense about doing evaluations and delivering them at the end of a program. Because all of the major decisions will have already been made. There's nobody to talk to at that point about the results. It just becomes an evaluation report that goes nowhere. So I've been involved in those reports, in those contracts. The moment the evaluation is agreed to, I immediately began negotiating and renegotiating, changing the deliverables, changing the timeline, figuring out when decisions are actually going to be made, and reorienting the evaluation scope of work and budget towards getting the best data possible when decisions will actually be made. That means at the very beginning of an evaluation, you start asking, when are there staff retreats? When will decisions about the future be made? When will the strategic process go on? How do we get our results into those processes? Work backwards, address that timing. That's how you ensure that you're useful, not just following some boilerplate, automatic midterm end of project scheme that makes no sense and doesn't get evaluations used. Not that I feel strongly about this, you can tell, but it is a major source of problems. There was one other question, Brooke, that I missed in the middle of those two.
Let me scroll up there quickly. Well, there was the difference between, in terms of the content to be evaluated between the minute, but you addressed that question, Michael.
Yeah, there was one before that, I think you had.
The shoestring. What is your view on increasing the use of shoestring evaluations, increasing demands? If
yeah,
not,
I really addressed it with the resource question, so I guess maybe we did get them all.
Yeah. There's two other questions here. Actually, a lot of questions that are coming in, so thank you everyone for your interest. Two questions here that I tried to group, and this concerns the question or the issue of buy-in from managers. But how would you could you give us Michael, some tips to increase the interest of evaluation results in the intended users, like program directors, donors, and stakeholders? And then another question was, how can evaluation managers, what can they do to strengthen management response and follow-up processes and increase that buy-in ownership from the evaluation intended users? So two questions there in terms of trying to get people to react and buy into the results.
Again, really great questions and important. So this involves the evaluator engaging directly with the users to find out what the relevant issues are. And that's where the personal factor comes in. So one of the kind of questions that I like to engage with management and with program staff is a question like, what don't you know that if you did know would make a difference to what you do? What don't you know that if you did know would make a difference to what you do? So it's actually finding out what their information needs are. Find out what decisions are forthcoming. What are the forks in the road? What are the challenges about how to allocate resources? And design the evaluation to be relevant to those questions. A lot of evaluations get designed in the abstract as a kind of accountability exercise in the abstract without looking at what the organization, the decision makers, the funders are actually thinking about, what they're facing, what they're trying to figure out. And so to engage with managers, with staff, with funders, with board members around issues that matter to them, that will inform what they're going to do, we have to interact with them. We have to be able to look at the decisions that they've already made, the issues that they're worried about and concerned about that are going to affect future decisions. And we have to pay attention, as you've heard me say now over and over again, to timing, to be sure that we get results to them in a way that informs the actions that they're going to take. So it's not a matter of just looking at a program and designing an evaluation. It's a matter of engaging with decision makers about what decisions they're actually going to be taking. What are the policy issues? What are the programming issues for program staff? And getting the best data possible to inform that action. I find that managers really want good data. Their objection is that most evaluations don't answer their questions. They're formulaic, they're standardized, they're routine, and they're not done in ways that really help them. So for example, a major way to increase the utility of an evaluation to managers is to disaggregate the data, to have evaluation reporting average results or overall indicators for something like the SDGs, and to show countrywide data on the SDGs or program level on the SDGs doesn't help you do anything. You have to disaggregate the data and see where are we doing well and where are we doing poorly. There are always subgroups, sub-areas, geographic differences, site differences. Those are the things that help you take action. average results are fairly worthless. Disaggregated, targeted data is what decision makers need to be able to make fine-tuned decisions.
Thank you, Michael. Another question here in terms of links to stakeholders and the relationship between managers and government counterparts. Looking at UNICEF's system in terms of the system in place with UNICEF managers and government counterparts tracking progress on implementation in terms of the decisions based on evaluation recommendations. Are similar practices in place, for example, in the United States government? And then another question, which was quite interesting, let me scroll down a bit. Well, this is another question with respect to follow-up on recommendations. Should the management response be mandatory? Should this be part of the process? And then another question, what was the other question I was looking for that I missed now? Well, the good practice in place to monitor the use of learning from evaluations, not just simply implementing recommendations, but actually learning from those recommendations as they may apply, for example, to other programs that weren't even evaluated. So if you could address those three questions, Michael, that would be great.
So the first question about tracking progress on implementation and whether that's done in the U.S. government, I wouldn't hold up the U.S. government as a good example of anything right now. It will not be helpful to look at the disaster of the U.S. government and think that we're going to learn anything from that at this moment in time. It is so deeply politicized, anti-science, anti-data. It's the main thing that the U.S. government illustrates these days is what you don't want to do around virtually all of these practices. There are exceptions. There are really good people who have stayed with the government, long-term career professionals who are doing the best that they can. But the senior decision makers in the current government in the U.S. could not be less interested in data. And they're cutting back on data and evaluation units, which is a matter of considerable concern. The challenge in tracking systems like UNICEF's and results-based management is to keep them from just becoming ends in themselves, keep them from becoming the worst kinds of ongoing bureaucratic reporting that simply checks off boxes that it got done that nobody pays attention to, which actually then relates to the next two questions about management response being mandatory and learning from it. I don't like mandatory kinds of requirements because it leads to compliance. And so the compliance behavior is people just going through the motions. I want to do an evaluation that has relevance and incentives for managers to engage, and they're doing it because they care about their work and they want to do a good job. Those are the people I look for to work with, are people who are going to do this because they care about the issues, they want to do a good job. When I'm working with folks, I regularly tell them that if you do evaluation because it's required by others, it will be an onerous activity and you'll hate it and it will be burdensome. But if you engage in evaluation, either using the results or producing the results, because you don't want to waste your short time on this earth doing things that don't work, because you genuinely care about the UNICEF mission, because you really care about children, that's the reason to do evaluation. And if evaluation isn't helping in those regards, then the evaluation itself is at fault. So we need to do work that attracts the attention of managers rather than forcing them to write a compliance report. The mandatory stuff tends to be very low level. Likewise, you can't force people to learn, but you can, one of the kinds of facilitation skills that evaluators need is how to facilitate learning. That takes some time, it takes some skill, how to extract lessons of applicability from one evaluation to a more general lesson. The difference between lessons and lessons learned becomes important. A lesson is a cognitive understanding that you extract knowledge or wisdom from an evaluation. A lesson learned is behavioral. Something has changed. It's actually being done. And so there is skill involved in extracting lessons. It's not automatic. I see a lot of evaluation reports that have lessons at the end of them that's a mishmash of all kinds of different things. Some small ones, some big ones, some of them not lessons at all. And so I've done a lot of work in looking at the lessons in evaluation reports. Most of what gets called lessons are not lessons. They're confused with findings, they're confused with recommendations, they're confused with opinions. A lesson is an extrapolation from the data about relevance to future and other situations. There's some skill involved, as I said, in doing that. It's worth practicing. And if you're generating good lessons, then it's worth having sessions to dig deeply into what those lessons mean. It takes time and commitment to generate lessons and attend to them, test them out, see if they're really lessons, learn more deeply. And that's part of what embedding evaluation in organizational culture is about.
Thank you, Michael. I don't know how we are doing time-wise, but there are obviously a lot of questions. I wanted to backtrack a little bit about what you were saying about the scope of intended users. And Carl has an interesting question here. In utilization-focused evaluation, should the evaluator challenge the scope of intended users if they consider it would exclude important stakeholders affected by the program being evaluated?
Great question. And I describe the role of the evaluator in utilization-focused evaluation as active, reactive, interactive, and adaptive. Active, reactive, interactive, and adaptive. The active piece is one of examining a situation, doing situation analysis, understanding what's going on, and indeed challenging the scope of work on everything. I regularly challenge scopes of work because they're often written by people who are not directly connected to the utilization of the evaluation. They're people who just write evaluation scopes of work and have no idea what the purpose of the evaluation is or what would make it useful. Indeed, I expect and make it a point of my contract negotiations and evaluation to say, we need to be able to renegotiate all aspects of the evaluation, including timing, how the money is allocated, and who the intended users are. If important voices are left out, if the beneficiaries are not going to be heard, if there are omissions of importance, then it is part of our responsibility to advocate on the part of getting multiple perspectives to be sure that we're able to provide the best possible results that will show what the multiple perspectives are, and to get data to the people who can most use it. So from a utilization-focused point of view, I find myself being very forceful about negotiating a scope of work to ensure that it is useful, and that means challenging virtually anything that may be in the scope of work that's not meaningful once we get underway, and being able to revise those things, the timing, the stakeholders, to better ensure that the evaluation is targeted to the right people and is gathering data from beneficiaries in a way that is meaningful.
Let me follow up with that question or that response rather, Michael, and just add another question from a colleague, which is really interesting and it's certainly challenging. But what are the practical tips you could suggest, for example, to give when evaluation is perceived as a fault-finding mission, particularly if those individuals happen to be intended users? How do you address that particular challenge?
It's a really important issue because evaluation comes with baggage, and the downside of part of what I'm talking about is that the ways in which evaluators are selected, especially independent external evaluators, doesn't ensure that they themselves are utilization focused. And so unfortunately, a lot of the people selected to do independent external evaluations are selected for their subject matter expertise, not because they know anything about evaluation, and often do a bad job. Or they are selected for political purposes in a fault finding. And so it is fair for the people receiving evaluations to look at the evaluator's credentials and knowledge. We certainly are aiming, the eval SDGs, eval partners are working to build evaluation capacity around the world. And that means having evaluators who can be utilization focused and know the standards. I did an article published a year ago for the American Journal of Evaluation, in which I argued that that the way that site visits are conducted in evaluation are scandalous. That one of the reasons that there's so much pushback by program staff and decision makers about the utility of evaluation is that so much of the work is poorly done, especially site visits, the most common form of evaluation, sending people, a team of 3 people off for 3 days to inspect a program, interview people, and write conclusions. Those do often end up being largely fault-finding kinds of conclusions. Well, one of the standards of evaluation calls for balance. There should be strengths and weaknesses pointed out, and that the evaluator should be competent to and credible to provide a balanced perspective. In that article, I make the radical suggestion, that on evaluation site visits, there ought to be at least one member, preferably the chair, who actually knows something about evaluation. And is a part of the evaluation profession and knows that there are standards for evaluation. That's often not the case. So I think that evaluation, like any powerful tool, can be used for good and can be used for harm. And when we have incompetent evaluators or people who don't know what they're doing, or things that are done just for fault finding, among other misuses of evaluation, that's one of the sources of resistance. That's a reason for organizations to examine carefully their policies about who is doing the evaluation, what constitute evaluation qualifications, who should be playing the evaluator role, and to create a culture of evaluation that increases the quality both of the evaluators doing the work and the quality of the decision makers in addressing evaluation.
Thank you, Michael. I think given the time, perhaps we should continue with your presentation and then come back to questions afterwards.
Okay, I'm just going to make a couple other major points.
Okay.
And thank you for that, Brooke. So here is, I use the jester as my symbol for an evaluator. It really relates to some of the questions we were just talking about. In medieval times, the role of the jester was to get the truth to the monarch, when monarchs tend to surround themselves by people who tell them what they want to hear, who flatter them and disguise what's really going on. The job of the jester in medieval times was to get truth to the monarch about what was really going on, but had to do so in a way that could be heard with humor and with care, so as to be able to have the monarch actually hear what was being told. So I've adopted the jester as my symbol for evaluation, and this cartoon makes fun of the idea that any evaluation can answer everyone's questions. And of course, that's what the notion of knowing who the primary intended users is about. So there are tensions between these different purposes, between accountability and learning, between judging the overall merit of a program and improving it. I see evaluations that simply throw in all the different purposes. The purpose of the evaluation is accountability and learning and summative, informative. Well, you can't do that all in one. These are actually things that are in tension with each other. So for example, to really do good learning, you need openness, you need safety, you need people to feel that they can honestly express concerns in a way that will be heard, but without being punished for that. That's very different than an accountability evaluation that determines whether or not you've done exactly what you were supposed to do in the way it was supposed to be done. And proving effectiveness is different than improving. So that's the reason for focusing on purpose, because these things are different. Basic evaluation literacy then is to know the evaluation standards, know how to apply the standards in the actual conduct of evaluations, understand different potential uses, understand how to identify and work with primary intended users, and be sure that evaluators have the essential skills to do that work. So I want to introduce here briefly a major additional type of use that's become very important in evaluation. It's what we call process use. For much of the time, and indeed today, we've been talking about the use of findings. Process use is the impact an evaluation has on an organization and the people involved through the process of engagement. Process use, as you see on this slide, refers to and is indicated by individual changes in thinking and behavior and program or organizational changes in procedures and culture that occur among those involved in evaluation as a result of the learning that occurs during the evaluation process. Evidence of process use is represented by the following kind of statement after an evaluation. The impact on our program came not so much or not just from the findings, but from going through the thinking process the evaluation required. So when evaluators facilitate logic models, program logic, picking indicators, because what gets measured gets done, clarifying relevant questions, the answer to the question that I asked earlier, what don't you know that if you did know would make a difference to what you do? The very process of asking those questions, the very process of establishing evaluation priorities affects what's going on in a program. The selection of indicators begins to change behavior as people address those indicators. So process use calls our attention to the ways in which evaluation has impact before any data are collected or beyond the actual findings by the engagement. And process use and evaluative thinking are getting more and more attention because those are longer term parts of organizational culture as compared to the findings of a particular evaluation, which get out of date fairly quickly. But learning how to think evaluatively, learning how to ask evaluation questions, learning how to make sense of data, learning how to make appropriate comparisons, disaggregating data for decision making. These skills aren't just evaluator skills, they're the capacity of decision makers and policymakers and program staff and even beneficiaries in participatory forms of evaluation to understand and use evaluation. So process use has become an important part of what goes on. The other thing I'll say quickly is that utilization-focused evaluation methods decisions involve conferring with the users about what kind of data will be credible to them, what kind of measurement makes sense. Some people prefer surveys versus interviews versus focus groups. Monitoring data can take different forms. There are different ways of doing these methods. And so it's important to understand that methods are not purely technical decisions. They are utilization decisions. The timing, for example, of findings. A researcher may want a lot more time to get more follow-up data but the decision is going to be taken earlier. And so methodologically, we need to time the data collection and reporting to inform actual decisions, not just the best design possible. It's what one of the evaluation pioneers, Peter Rossi, called good enough evaluations. We get as good a data as we can on major questions in a timely fashion, rather than have really great, perfect evaluations done after the decisions have already been taken. This is controversial. Many of my colleagues in evaluation agree that evaluators ought to engage with users around their intended users. But when it comes to actually designing the evaluation, they believe that the methodologists, the people trained in research, should independently make those methods decisions. I argue that most of the methods decisions actually have wiggle room in them, that there are methodological options that affect credibility. And rather than me as an evaluator making those decisions unilaterally, I want to know what kind of data will be most useful and most credible to the people who are going to have to act upon it. And that means engaging with them around decisions, sampling size decisions, instrument kinds of decisions, comparison decisions, design decisions, so that they understand the implications of the design before we do the evaluation, not just after, but before, so that they can weigh in and we can be sure that the evaluation will be credible. So let me stop with those two additional points: the process use in addition to findings use, and engaging intended users in methods decisions, and see what additional comments or questions may come up.
Thank you, Michael. Like we said, there's really a lot of questions here, very interesting questions. I'm not sure we're going to have time to address them all, but one question that came up was with respect to, the efforts that are ongoing to update the DAC criteria, and whether utilization actually should be amongst them. That's an interesting question that was raised. Another question is with respect to, let me find it here, the SDGs. Trying to find it here. Another question actually with respect to the intended users is your suggestions on setting expectations with stakeholders before one undertakes evaluation activities. That's a second question. And then the question with respect to SDGs is, what type of evaluation do we need to track progress on the SDGs, and might it be a combination of all types?
So let me start with the SDG question and work backward to the others. I think that yes, the SDGs should be more than simply reporting indicators. That one of the things that we need to be able to do is to bring the full arsenal of evaluation to bear on the SDGs, and that includes. I've been doing a lot of work to help people conceptualize how to engage across the SDGs and not treat them as silos, to look at the interconnections among the SDGs, so that we take something like I was recently working with a major philanthropic foundation that has a major program in population control and reproductive health, a major program in girls' education, a major program in agriculture, and each of them are addressing a single SDG. But in fact, what we know from research is that the best way to delay child marriage and reduce the number of children a woman has is to keep her in school. And that one of the reasons that in some parts of the world that young girls don't stay in school is that they are growing food. They're responsible for helping with farming and with childcare. And so if we actually do agricultural schools for girls, because most agricultural schools right now are only for boys, if we actually did agricultural schools for girls, we would be combining zero hunger goals, girls' education, gender equity, population control, anti-poverty. And so one of the areas I think will make the SDGs more useful is to not silo them, but to look at their interconnections and their interrelationships at a program level. When I teach the SDGs from a utilization-focused point of view, I have people take them and arrange them in connection with each other rather than simply have these siloed indicators systems. And as I said earlier, having only nation-state data at an average level is not very useful for decision-making. Disaggregating the SDGs by area, by different program areas, helps make decisions about how to improve performance on them. And yes, there are formative uses of SDG evaluations, developmental evaluation, summative evaluations of which kind of initiatives are really working, knowledge generating, lessons learned out of SDGs. One of the things that I would hope would happen is that the SDGs moves from just being an indicator system to, in fact, drawing on the full repertoire of evaluation uses to help accelerate and improve the meaningfulness of SDGs. So I appreciate that question because I think it's quite important. The question about the DAC criteria is really a good one. There is consideration of revising the DAC criteria, and the DAC criteria are different than the DAC standards. So there are the 5 DAC criteria for evaluation, which are actually quite out of date. For example, one of the DAC criteria is sustainability, defined as whether an initiative continues after the funding is over. But the real importance in a climate change world of sustainability is not whether or not you continue doing the same thing, which is a very static, rigid definition of sustainability, but the resilience and adaptive capacity of an initiative, of a program. Does it have adaptive capacity going forward? Can it adjust to changing conditions and turbulence and things like climate change? So I think the DAC criteria are in bad need of revision, and that the DAC standards, including use, could help inform that revision. The standards and the criteria are not really well aligned. Utilization is strong in the DAC criteria, but not the utilization is strong in the DAC standards, but not mentioned in the criteria. And so the greater attention to use, I would hope, would be part of that revision process. I think each of the current criteria needs to be reframed in light of the SDGs, in light of climate change, in light of how the field itself has developed. And I'm glad to see that process is underway, and I hope that all of the sponsors of this webinar will participate actively in that process because it's important. Was there another question, Brooke, that I missed here?
Well, another question I wanted to which is quite interesting, building on what you were saying between the trade-off or the tension between accountability and learning. What would be some good practices and innovative ones that you could suggest from organizations on how to integrate learning from an evaluation into program planning and decision-making after evaluations have taken place, and maybe provide some insight with respect to SDGs and evaluations that may be underway in the future for evaluating the 2030 agenda or policies related to the 2030 agenda. And then another question, which is interesting, is sort of the trade-off between what we could call ensuring use of an evaluation, but having perhaps the perfect evaluation design. And have you confronted situations where you had to sacrifice, so to speak, perfect evaluation design with considerations to ensure better use? Those are two additional questions. Maybe take those in turn.
Right. Thank you. So again, great questions. The first one is quite important, and really relates, Brooke, to your area of strategic work, is that a major way to integrate learning into organizations and programs with evaluation is to actually have a learning agenda. Too much of the lessons learned work is extracted after the fact. What we've learned is that you're more likely to learn something if you actually create learning questions going in. And so for example, to relate that to the SDGs, if you create learning questions about how is climate change affecting the work with children in a particular UNICEF arena, and how what kind of how do we help beneficiaries, mothers and families understand what's happening with climate and how that's going to affect their future. That creating a learning agenda about how to explain to people, beneficiaries, what's going on, why the world is turbulent, what's happening, how their own lives may be affected. It's a major source of changes in agriculture and forcing people into migration. So having a learning agenda increases the likelihood of learning. I know that sounds almost redundant, but I find, in fact, that very few organizations in collaboration with evaluation, create a learning agenda and then ask questions, gather data and ask questions that can then be processed to learn from them, rather than kind of after the fact saying, okay, the evaluation got done, what did we learn? Without a learning agenda. And it ought to be then a part of the strategic process. When people are doing strategy and setting strategy, I like to see a learning agenda to be part of strategic direction, so that learning agenda helps with adaptation of the strategy. The second part, ensuring use against perfect designs, I can fairly safely say I've never done a perfect design. There are always trade-offs. Even researchers don't get to do perfect designs. There are always constraints. And there are never all the resources and all the time that we could want. The most common constraint is the one that I mentioned earlier, and that is that getting data in time to inform a decision often means not having as much follow-up as we would like, not being able to pursue the longer term outcomes of a program, not being able to look at what develops over time, because data is needed for a decision sooner rather than later. And so the sort of wisdom, the lesson around this is that it's better to have some data in time to make a decision than to have perfect data after the decision is made. So that's the reality of having to do trade-offs in the real world is, but you have to know that timing. And when I say having data in time to inform a decision, the situation assessment of that includes not just knowing the decision is going to be taken on November 6th, and therefore you provide data on December 6th. No, it means if a decision is going to be taken on December 6th or November 6th, then you have to back up and say, so when are the documents in support of that decision being put together? When are the preparation meetings and the preparation materials being done? So if there's a board meeting on November 6th, they probably have a package of materials that was sent out to them a month earlier, and the evaluation information is going to have to be in that packet if it's going to inform a decision on November 6th. So we have to think very practically, very strategically about how to get findings in time to make a difference. And that's going to mean that the evaluations are never perfect. That's the reason for discussing methods with the intended users, is to recognize what these imperfections are, what the trade-offs are. Sometimes they come up with more time and money in order to get a better evaluation when they actually understand what the methodological constraints are, or what the shoestring is, and that the shoestring is not going to be enough to do a good job.
Thank you, Michael. An interesting question just came in from Robert in terms of this trade-off, or this dilemma in some respects between objectivity and perhaps even independence on the one hand and engagement on the other. Would you involve key intended users in, for example, an evaluation report editing group in the name of promoting process use, as you referred to it? That's quite interesting to build on the slide that you presented on process use. Christina also asked a question in terms of providing any concrete examples, or perhaps even a story in terms of helping to make sure that recommendations were internalized and acted upon in one of your evaluations that you've been involved in. So that's a question from Christina. Jumping around a bit as well. Well, perhaps you can address those two questions in the meantime.
Yeah, I appreciate both those questions. There's this unfortunate myth that somehow interacting with decision makers undermines independence and objectivity. And it's a really insidious and unfortunate notion, because being external to and not having interactions with key decision makers, I would argue, doesn't ensure independence and objectivity. It ensures cluelessness, and that you don't know what's going on. So you don't sacrifice independence and objectivity by engaging with people professionally in a way to find out what their issues are, and being sure that the evaluation addresses those issues. It's simply a myth. If you are an accomplished professional who knows how to address issues with neutrality and balance, then you can interact with key policymakers to be sure the evaluation is relevant. That's not the same as manipulating the findings to come up with predetermined answers. That's corruption of the evaluation. But relevance, to be sure you're on the right track, requires such interaction to be sure that we're on the right track. On an example of evaluation I've just recently done of an after-school program here in the United States that's targeted to African-American children, and that is another one that's targeted to Native American, Indigenous, Aboriginal children. In both of those cases, the philanthropic funders were wanting to judge those programs by achievement test data, by the scores of the children on test in school. Each of these programs is what's being called a culturally responsive program. So the African American program is looking at African heritage. The Native American program is looking at American Indian heritage. And my recommendation was that it was inappropriate to judge an after-school program by test scores. That's the job of the school. And therefore, the after-school program should be judged on the basis of its cultural outcomes with the children, strengthening their cultural identity, supporting their community. And we used a framework of looking at what the after-school program was actually doing to recommend to funders that they change the outcome criteria for these after-school programs. That required a considerable discussion with the funders, and the overall main funder of the program and that board after discussion and presentation, very much agreed to reframe how they were evaluating after-school programs and their purpose based upon that recommendation.
Thank you, Michael, for that case. Just one perhaps final question, and then I'll be handing the webinar over to my colleague Florence Etta for some closing remarks as we slowly draw to a close. But how much does utilization look at this broader enabling environment, Michael? If you could give us some insight on that.
Well, I appreciate that, and what I've described is situation analysis, which is the first step in any utilization-focused evaluation. Understanding the situation, understanding the environment. Increasingly, that situation analysis and the understanding the enabling environment is key to determining everything else that happens afterwards. So it's really not effective to begin an evaluation as a closed system, simply doing the evaluation off the shelf or a predetermined design without understanding the situation and the enabling environment. That's part of the upfront work. The reason I was emphasizing that utilization-focused evaluation requires tilling the soil, upfront work, engagement with stakeholders is precisely to that point. We need to understand the enabling environment and work within that and engage with it in order to enhance use.
Thank you very much, Michael, on that. Do you have additional slides? I'm not sure where we stand with the actual presentation.
No, we did get through them all.
We did get through them all. Florence, I indicated at the outset that I would be handing the floor over to you to say some concluding remarks. I think we're slowly approaching 10:30 time, Eastern Standard Time in the United States. Is Florence there?
Myself?
There you are, Florence.
Yes. I would like to say thank you, Brooke, for steering this so admirably. But more than anything else, I'd like to thank Michael Quinn Patton. Michael, I don't know if you remember me, but you gave me the first utilization-focused workshop in 2007 in Niger, Niamey, Niger. And then I was with you somewhere in Ottawa for your early developmental workshops again. I find it very, very interesting and very useful that you have given us the time, 1.5 hours, a lot of time for you. And you have basically taken us through, this is like a tour de force. And you have not only given us the value of your book, the four editions, brought it to us in real life. You have animated this conversation incredibly well. Lots of chats, lots of people have been saying thank you very much. They've learned a lot. And I want to join them in thanking you for this absolutely educating interaction you've given us today. I just want to say that you, because of your stature as one of the foremost evaluators and thinkers in the space, would probably definitely have a different kind of interaction with commissioners and managers of evaluations that you take on. But you have given us a challenge to try and basically negotiate tours and try and see how we can expand the use of our results better than that image you gave to us for evaluation reports holding up windows and desks. The challenge for us is that as independent evaluators, or even as evaluators working within evaluation systems organizations, the power we have to change tours is very small. Sometimes, in fact, most times, you get a set of a document that tells you what you're supposed to do, and often there's not enough time even to negotiate with that. So I think it is useful that you have told us, given us examples of what we can do. So on behalf of all of the 300 plus evaluators and people worldwide that joined this webinar today, I'd like to say thank you so much, Michael. It was such an honor to listen to you, and it was nowhere near disappointing. Your humility, your dexterity, your honesty has been incredible, and I'd like to say thank you again from all of us.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And also, Michael, thank you very much from my end as well. And I certainly echo everything that Florence has said. So thank you so much. And thanks also to all the participants, including the number of participants that asked very, very interesting questions.
Yes, yes. Incredible. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.